When delving into the self-help world for the first time, the first handful of gurus I was exposed to were people like Tai Lopez, Tony Robbins, and by extension, Gary Vaynerchuk. The first two I never really clung to or listened to extensively, and in the case of Vaynerchuk, I only occasionally listened to some of his vlogs where he would share business advice and the occasional bit about life. Overall, he kind of helped me out a little bit whenever I felt kind of in a slump. Other than that, I'm likely one of the weirdest gurus out there because I've gained a lot of my perspective and my beliefs around self-help mostly through my own experiences, interpreting them myself, writing them out, and adjusting based on new information that is given to me by just random people who happen to comment about some of my observations. But be that as it may, there is clearly a big gap in my overall knowledge. An area where you could easily form biases and perhaps unfounded bases for a lot of the claims that I make in my articles as well as these videos. The fact I haven't been particularly exposed to a lot of women in the self-help industry providing their own perspectives to the self-help world and offering tips and advice. There are women like Oprah that stand out to me, though she's more of a platformer of people than an actual guru, I would say. A few years ago, I became acquainted with Rachel Hollis, a woman I briefly researched in the process of looking into her ex-husband, Dave Hollis, who passed away. Her story is particularly an interesting one that I should honestly cover at a later date because some of her takes and the life that she was leading are both very interesting on a self-help level. But the woman that I really want to be focusing on today in this video is one that has been rising the ranks as a popular household name, Mel Robbins. If you haven't heard of her yet, well, we sure have now. But overall, her approach to self-help is refreshing, to say the least.
Ooh, that's good.
Practical and simple, her books have made the advice, as well as herself, very approachable. Beyond that, there's the obvious note of the fact that she shares the last name with another famed self-help guru, Tony Robbins. No, they are not married or related, but it's a coincidence that these two people share the same last name and they are both self-help gurus. Funny how last names work. But all around, Mel Robbins seems like a genuine female self-help guru that wants to be helping other people with her simple strategies and little quirky life hacks. She's funny, the advice is overall simple, and she isn't being overly aggressive with sales tactics from what I have gathered.
Good.
Even her own origin story of how she got into the self-help world and what sparked her first book is also a very genuine one that anyone can relate to, being on the brink of absolute failure and not having genuine safety nets that you can reliably bounce back onto. She seems, on the surface, as one of the good self-help gurus that we actually need in this industry to actually change it.
Don't give me hope.
But as you can tell from the title of this video, I'm not going to be gushing about Mel Robbins for that long. In fact, that's about all the praise that I have for her, and that's based off of what I've researched thus far. Because Mel Robbins isn't the greatest guru out there. Nor is she someone that I can really count on to be changing up the industry, despite the praise that she's gotten from handling critics, criticism, and her overall approach to self-help. To her credit, there are some good things about her teachings, and they're not necessarily malicious or deceptive, but there are several major flaws in that go back to even when she first entered into the self-help world in 2017 that I want to be talking about. So let's talk about all of that and break down the advice that made her famous in the first place, the 5-second rule. To begin, it's worth asking what exactly the 5-second rule is according to Mel Robbins, because it's not the one that's surrounding the myth of how long a piece of food can remain on the ground before it becomes unedible. Robbins explains her 5-second rule is simply a countdown that she uses in her head to help her perform a specific task. In her very first book, she talked about how this strategy helped her with getting out of bed because she had a tendency of just slapping the snooze button on her clock. The premise is very simple. If you're hesitating in your life for any particular reason, you want to be counting down from 5 and then taking the plunge once you hit 0. You want to be picturing yourself as a sort of an astronaut and getting ready for liftoff. Overall, it's decent advice. It's not exactly bold or revolutionary, but rather it's simple and a lot easier to process without being too damaging or too demanding of people's lives. It's a delicate balance, really.
Perfectly balanced, as all things should be.
And the book that this rule took front and center was a major hit. She sold over 22 million copies of this book, and it was sold to consumers as this very easy, accessible, science-backed, and proven method that actually works. But, as I've said at the start of this video, there are some major issues with them. So let's dive into that. The first issue with the 5-second rule is the claim that this rule is science-backed. I don't know about you, but when something is claimed to be science-backed, I would expect some studies and some research that is actually being conducted and that is available to the public. It's readily available, it's pointed to, it's discussed. And while I don't know if the book does actually point to anything in particular, I personally can't find any research papers whenever I'm Googling the 5-second rule. The only thing I was able to find was some discussion in 2016 about how long food can actually last if it falls on the floor, and that the whole 5-second rule is merely a myth. The only other science I could actually find is that Robbins is basically just using psychological concepts to prove her theory. Her argument on a scientific level is that her strategy activates the prefrontal cortex of our brain. This is the part of our brain where we can change our behavior on something, direct our thoughts, as well as learn new things. The only issue with the science, though, is that all of it is pure conjecture and personal experiences.
That wasn't flying, that was falling with style.
It's not exactly pseudoscience, because it's based off of agreed upon theories that the psychological community agrees with. But her advice is just so simple and bland that it's not exactly something that's debatable or something that you could really test. It's like saying that the sky is blue or that birds aren't real. These are just things that we generally agree on, and there's no real scientific basis to try and prove that.
Reason number 2. Look what I can do.
But what does that have to do with anything?
No. He's got a point.
But simultaneously, it's a little deceitful if you're telling readers that, hey, all of this stuff is just science-backed and it's proven, when it's actually just based off of scientific conjecture. There isn't really a solid basis to say that you're counting down from 5 is going to help with motivating yourself, and that there's a lot of science and research that is conducted to prove that point. It's just a whole trust me, bro, I know what I'm doing, I know what I'm talking about.
When you inflate the balloon, could you do it in the form of a kitten?
Of course I can. I can do anything. I can do absolutely anything.
Setting aside all of that science stuff, though, the practicality of it is also just a little suspect. After all, as much as simple advice is seemingly helpful, there are some major problems with framing all of our problems in this particular manner. That we can just count down from 5 and immediately find all of the motivation that we absolutely need in order to get a task done. The first of which is that our problems aren't always as simple that a countdown is absolutely necessary or genuinely helpful. For sure, the 5-second rule is a cute little motivational trick, but you still have to deal with the task that solves the problem that you're dealing with in the first place. And depending on your own circumstances, you might not be wrestling with just getting out of bed. It's important to keep in mind that Mel Robbins started this practice in February of 2008, and she didn't publish this strategy until 2017. I'm not aware of how she frames it, but it's not exactly a panacea, particularly for those who want to see slightly faster results and changes in their lives than that. Especially for people of color and those who didn't have a bunch of options or things that they could be doing to ease their own problems. At the core of it, the 5-second rule is designed to be a motivator, a simple way to change a slight behavior in your life and tackle objectives. A way to set aside your own feelings and just get something done.
Yesterday, you said tomorrow, so just do it!
Not only does this strategy tiptoe a little into overall hustle culture, where we ought to be working more, which isn't exactly a sound strategy, I'd argue this also isn't a great way to motivate yourself in several ways. For one, it's a strategy that is asking you to discard your feelings, which on the surface can be good, but very situational. Sure, you can push yourself to not sleep in for 5 more minutes, but it's a different situation when you actually need to do something you genuinely do not want to do. As someone who wrote articles that I wasn't particularly keen on writing about, the incentive was that it paid the bills, and me counting down from 5 probably wouldn't be doing anything in that particular matter as a primary motivator for me to write those particular articles.
Work, work. Work, work.
The second is that the more that you look at the strategy, the more cookie cutter it's made out to be. You need to be in a specific situation in order for this to work effectively. From my experiences, you really don't want your own motivational sources to be this conditional.
Not good enough!
It has to be snappy, it has to be effective, it has to be personable, and cookie cutter solutions just really don't work in that particular way. Overall, I believe that there are more personable strategies that you could be using to motivate yourself aside from this 5-second rule. For example, using some gentle affirmations as a way to bolster yourself and bolster your confidence and getting things done. To me, I could see the 5-second rule could act more as a crutch rather than something that can genuinely motivate you long term as well. The final critique I have about this strategy is that while it can break down barriers around fears or general procrastination, as Mel Robbins argues, it could also arguably be the same reason to reinforce those procrastination tendencies and fears. One of the problems with simple advice is how it offers these cookie cutter solutions without context or consideration of who you are and your own situation. You need to discard all of that for the sake of this solution to work. And that's not something that a lot of people really want to be doing or could possibly do. There could be a much larger barrier that you would be dealing with beyond not being in the mood to do something or procrastination tendencies. And using this strategy could result in just being indifferent of the task that you're doing or even fearing the countdown itself. After all, who's to say that we can use our prefrontal cortex to dread a task even more or focus on dreading the countdown itself? I see this with a lot of vision boards where creating them is this fun experience and very exhilarating and thrilling. But if you try to put them into practice, a lot of them tend to fail and crumble apart because we end up seeing it more as just a collage of things that we will never have, that we have a desire for but don't really have the means of actually making that happen. And those methods become more of a detriment to our own motivation, and we just end up giving up entirely on that, rather than actually trying to fulfill these objectives and these goals and desires. Just like vision boards, the 5-second rule could easily play a role into that, where we just dread counting down and actually doing the task itself. Or we could just see this as just another pointless strategy to add to the pile of all of the other suggestions that the self-help industry offers.
That's not good enough!
As I've said plenty of times in the past, I'm not expecting self-help advice to be absolutely flawless, bulletproof, and perfect in every possible way. We're all humans here. We're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to have our own flaws. And despite my concerns, I can imagine that some people have genuinely found Mel Robbins' simple advice on counting down from 5 to be vaguely useful in their lives, and have been able to make some changes. Hell, this advice as a whole isn't really that egregious compared to some of the other advice that I have heard over the past several years. But at the same time, now that Robbins is more of a public figure thanks to that advice, it is worth looking at how she handles conflict, critiques, criticism, and other such things. And looking back at her earlier work can really show signs of more recent behavior. For example, Robbins has gotten bolder about hiding certain details. The whole science-backed thing is a nitpick in the grand scheme of things, but it's a very different story when the claim to her let them theory was this ancient wisdom that she happened to fall upon when there was a whole entire movement that was very small that started it back in 2022. That's not exactly ancient history or ancient wisdom as much as we might feel like it is due to the fact that it was in the middle of the COVID pandemic. My point is, just as it's important to nitpick about tiny details, it's also important to look at the guru themselves. Are they growing? Are they learning? Are they changing for the better and genuinely helping people? If the answer is yes to those things, it's worth sticking around with them and being part of that journey and sharing that growth and helping them out as they are helping you in turn. And if the answer is no, then it's better to leave that person behind and figure out how to move on. And that's all I have to say. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I'd like to remind you to leave a like on this video and also to subscribe to this channel for more content in the future.